Hey, I'm here to give you a quick overview of Lesson 1 and Lesson 2 over the age of imperialism. As you learned in Lesson 1, imperialism is when a stronger country gains control over a weaker country, usually for economic profit. We'll talk about the profit part more of this later. One problem I run into a lot when people try to put this in their own words is people will say it's when a bigger country takes control over a smaller country, which in many cases is actually not correct. Oftentimes, it's a smaller country in terms of land size and even population taking over a larger country in terms of land mass and in terms of population, and using that larger country for their natural resources for their cheap labor. What makes the difference between a stronger country and a weaker country at this time is often their industrial production and their industrial power. So more modernized countries, more industrialized countries, as we learned about in the Industrial Revolution, have an advantage over other countries, even if that country is significantly larger and is significantly more populated. On the right side there's a few pictures of a man taking candy from a baby. The first one is Peter Griffin. You have this picture of the baby crying as someone eats his candy, and then the last picture of a guy stealing candy and walking away. I think this is a good illustration of what imperialism actually is, because you have someone stronger taking something from a weaker country for their own personal gain or their own profit, or in this case, just their own satisfaction. The age of imperialism began during the later stages of the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1800s and really picked up steam during the Second Industrial Revolution, which began in 1870. It's going to continue to the start of World War I in 1914 and really continues on until probably about the end of World War II, with many of these countries maintaining their colonies. Industrialized countries took over territory, usually for their own benefit, their own profit, sometimes military bases, and the continents that were really targeted were Africa and Asia. And a colony is territory under the power of a foreign country or ruler. In America, a lot of times we think of the 13 colonies with the American Revolution and everything leading up to that. But in this time period, we're thinking of colonies not necessarily as people going from Europe and starting a new settlement overseas, as people going from Europe and really using the people that are already there for their own benefit, profit, resources, cheap labor, in some cases actually have these people conscribed into the army during World War I. Here's a map of imperialism at the end of the age of imperialism. Everything that is not white on this map is something that is taken over during the age of imperialism by a European country or Japan or the United States. And some of these white areas are a little bit misleading, because if you look at South America and Central America, those places were actually colonized way back in the age of exploration. And if you look on the white area in Asia, where China is, China actually was not turned into a colony, but it was imperialized in many ways in the fact that they lost control of their economic powers and were really forced to trade and do other things that they weren't really wanting to do during this time. So most of the world at this point becomes some kind of colony or takes over and forms their own colonies. So the second lesson is about industrialization and imperialism and how industrialization leads to imperialism. So industrialization brought about a lot of economic competition and a global economy. As a result of the Industrial Revolution, as we said earlier, the Second Industrial Revolution, which was from 1870 to 1914, and in a game that would be kind of the last few rounds of that game, you see a lot of improvements in transportation, a lot of improvements in terms of communication, and just over the whole course of the Industrial Revolution, the production of manufactured goods seems to go up and increase quite a bit. And this takes place mostly in Europe and North America, specifically the United States. And these improvements in transportation and communication help bring about a more global economy. So with the steamship, as you see on the right there, and the railroads, you start to see goods being transported not only within your country, but across the Atlantic and all across the world to these different places that you couldn't interact with very easily before the Industrial Revolution. And you have railroads across Europe, across England and Europe. You have the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States, which connects both the east and the west part of the United States at this time. And all these nations are not only competing for regional power, but they're competing against countries all across the world for economic power and for wealth. And competition becomes very intense at this point. And lastly, you see communication improves, which actually increases trade as well. And this is a picture of a telegraph wire. You have the transatlantic cable being a connector between Europe and North America, and you have messages being sent across the Atlantic in a matter of almost instantaneously instead of months, which was the case earlier before. So all the global economy brings is more economic competition, and the more industrialized countries are really going to dominate this, specifically the United States and the more westernized countries in Europe. Capitalism becomes a major change in the way things are going during the Industrial Revolution. You have private ownership, people looking to gain profit. You no longer have feudalism in these industrialized countries. And these private business people, these corporations, they really compete against each other to obtain wealth through trade and manufacturing of goods. And this competition is going to help bring about imperialism. So as we said, this competition is going to help bring about imperialism. And one thing you need to become powerful this time is be industrialized. And industrialism brings a lot of needs. So in order to compete in a global economy and increase profits, these European countries want to become more industrialized and produce more goods and be able to trade more goods. In order to produce more goods, they need actual natural resources or raw materials, such as precious metals, iron, even silver. You have oil and rubber. Oil is a big deal to fuel these machines. You have coal is another big deal to fuel these machines. And rubber becomes a big deal with the development of cars and bicycles at this time. So all these raw materials are needed to fuel industrialization, and some countries such as England and the United States are going to do pretty well in terms of these resources, but they want more. Other countries such as Belgium and Japan really don't have a whole lot of natural resources or a very big population, so they're going to look to new places to kind of fill that void. And in addition to the raw materials, they want new markets. Some of these places are producing a lot of materials, but don't necessarily have a great market to sell it to. So they're trying to sell it across Europe, but they're going to look beyond Europe at this point, and they look to North America, and then after North America, you're going to look at Asia and Africa, and anywhere you can kind of see these huge populations in order to trade and sell your materials. The problem is when they turn to Asia and India and China and other places in Asia, they're not really going to want these industrialized products. They want something else, and that's going to turn into some conflict that we're going to learn about in lesson 3, 4, and 5. But they're looking for new markets to sell their goods, and they're also looking for cheap labor. So here's the new markets. They need places to sell their industrialized products. And lastly, cheap labor. And with the reforms of the later parts of the Industrial Revolution, you have child labor laws, you have labor unions forming to get higher pay, better working hours, and cheap labor is not as cheap as it used to be in Europe. So these European countries are looking across the world, in Asia and specifically Africa, for cheap labor and basically slave-like labor, even beyond what you see today in some of these poorer countries that manufacture goods. And a lot of this labor at this time was treated very poorly, and we'll learn about that when we talk about the colonization of Africa, specifically the colonization of the Congo. As industrial production improved, one thing that went along with that, with transportation, with communication, was also developments in the military and weapon development. European countries had a long history of war among each other, and this rivalry each country wanted to improve their military. The most recent war among these was the Franco-Prussian War, something we haven't had a chance to talk about really in class, but this was between France and Germany, and this is really where Germany unites as a country and becomes a world power. But even before the Franco-Prussian War, you had the 7 Years' War, the French Revolution, You had the Napoleonic Wars, just a series of wars every 30, 40, 50 years in Europe that really took almost all the major European powers in and had some major consequences. So these wars led to a lot of distrust between these European countries, and in the case of the Franco-Prussian War, probably hatred between France and Germany, similar to what we saw with hatred between France and Britain after the 7 Years' War, and rivalry pretty much among all the European countries. And during the Industrial Revolution, as I said earlier, there were a lot of military advancements. You go from very simplistic militaries with muskets to very advanced weapons, kind of the beginning of what you see today, not in terms of nuclear power, but in terms of tanks and airplanes and naval ships and guns. So military advancements were made, weapon production increased. You have machine guns, you have powerful artillery that can shoot miles. You have naval warships that outdo anything up to that point and really allow European countries and the United States to take over many of these places that they land. And you have the creation of aircraft. So you're going to see zeppelins and airplanes by the end of World War I actually play a big role in this. And they got their start here during the age of imperialism. So there's a lot of distrust between European countries, but this military advancements give them a huge advantage over less industrialized countries. So when Britain goes and fights a war against China or India, their guns and warships are going to be a huge advantage. Similar to the United States, when Matthew Perry visits Japan, you're going to see Japan not really even put up a fight because they know it is not going to work. So Britain at this time was the first country to industrialize, and one thing that they had a huge advantage of was their navy. But just like France and Germany are going to have a rivalry, Britain and Germany are going to develop a rivalry as well because Germany's navy is improving, and now you're going to see Germany, United States, and Britain really emerge above all the other industrialized countries. So every country had a lot of national pride at this point. You had Germany, Britain, France, the United States, Japan. All these countries believe that their country was the best. You have Russia in there. And sometimes nationalism united countries, sometimes nationalism divided countries, and you had different ethnic groups wanting their independence. When we're talking about nationalism right now, we're going to talk about industrialized countries believing that their country was the best and better than all the other countries, and they really want to go out of their way to prove their superiority by having better weapons or more land or a stronger economy, whatever it is that they could do to prove that they were the best. And along with the idea of nationalism ties in the idea of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism increased competition because it's the whole idea of survival of the fittest. If you do not advance, if you do not become stronger, if you don't have a strong military, a strong economy, stable government, you're going to collapse. And these countries that are more powerful than you are going to take over. So it really comes down to survival of the fittest and take over or be taken over. Japan was famously quoted, one of their people was famously quoted for saying, "We have a choice to make. We can either dominate or be dominated." And along with this comes a concept called white man's burden. And this is the humanitarian perspective for imperialism. So you had missionaries scattered across the globe spreading Christianity, and many of these people were doing it to help out the people that they were encountering, spread religion, spread clean water, and all these great things that industrialization brought. But in many cases, this was used as an excuse to take over countries that were not industrialized and really view superior to these countries. And that's kind of where we're going to end up in today, is they want to bring civilization to the barbarians. Sometimes this was well-intended. Other times it was just a cover for an excuse to get away with some of these things that were going on that we'll learn about later. So tomorrow, or in the next lesson, we're going to start learning about imperialism in Asia. We will start off by talking about India. We'll talk about imperialization in China, and then kind of a different turn and talk about imperialization with Japan, where they actually are able to take over a lot of territory rather than being taken over. All right, thanks for listening. If you have any questions, email me, and look forward to hearing from you soon. Bye.